Hello, friend. Welcome back to Historic Life Stories. Today we're visiting one of the darkest chapters in Viking history, where fear itself was forged into a weapon. What if the most terrifying Viking of all time wasn't the strongest, but the weakest? A man who could barely stand, yet commanded armies through fear alone. His enemies called him a monster. His name was Ivar the Boneless. Before we dive into today's topic, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button if you like listening to my videos. And if you feel like it, throw in a thumbs up. It really helps me a lot. Thank you. I'd also love to hear where you're tuning in from around the world. So drop a comment below and share any topic suggestions you'd like me to cover next. Now, let's step into the world of the most brutal Viking and uncover the chilling story that made him famous. Ivar the Boneless, the most brutal Viking who ever lived. In the blood-soaked annals of Viking history, where warriors earned their place in Valhalla through acts of extraordinary violence, one name stands above all others as the embodiment of pure, calculated brutality. This is not a tale of honor or heroic conquest, but of a man so merciless that even his fellow Vikings, warriors who lived by the sword and gloried in battle, whispered that he was too violent for their brutal age. His name was Ivar the Boneless, and his story reads like a nightmare written in blood across the map of medieval Europe. Born into a world where strength meant survival, Ivar faced a cruel irony. He possessed what may have been osteogenesis imperfecta, a condition that left his bones as fragile as those of an elderly woman. Yet from this physical weakness emerged a mind so cunning and a heart so ruthless that he would become the most feared Viking leader of his generation. Today, we descend into the dark world of Ivar the Boneless, a man who transformed his physical limitations into psychological weapons, who turned strategic brilliance into an instrument of terror, and who orchestrated some of the most horrific acts of violence in medieval history. This is the story of how a broken body housed an unbroken spirit, and how that spirit chose the path of absolute brutality. Prepare yourself for a journey into the mind of a medieval monster, where mercy was weakness, where torture was art, and where the screams of enemies were sweeter than any victory song. Chapter 1. The Making of a Monster. To understand the depths of Ivar's brutality, we must first understand the world that forged him. Born in the early 9th century, Ivar was the son of Ragnar Lothbrok, the legendary Viking chieftain, whose very name struck terror into the hearts of monks and kings across Europe. But where Ragnar was a force of nature, unpredictable, fierce, and ultimately human in his motivations, Ivar was something far more sinister. From birth, Ivar's condition marked him as different. In a culture that prized physical strength above almost all other virtues, where a warrior's worth was measured by his prowess with sword and axe, Ivar's brittle bones should have condemned him to a life of obscurity or early death. Instead, they became the forge in which his cruelty was hammered into its final, terrible form. Unable to prove himself through traditional Viking means, the raid, the duel, the battlefield charge, Ivar developed alternative methods of asserting dominance. Where other Vikings relied on brute force, Ivar cultivated psychological warfare. Where others inspired loyalty through shared hardship, Ivar commanded obedience through calculated terror. The sagas tell us that even as a child, Ivar displayed an unsettling intelligence paired with a complete absence of what we might call normal human empathy. While his brothers played at war with wooden swords, Ivar studied his enemies' weaknesses. While other children learned to fight, Ivar learned to manipulate, to deceive, and most importantly, to identify exactly what would cause his opponents the greatest possible suffering. His physical condition, rather than limiting him, became his greatest weapon. Opponents who expected a weakened foe instead found themselves facing a mind that had spent years compensating for physical limitations by developing ever more sophisticated methods of inflicting pain. Ivar understood something that many warriors never learned, that the body's capacity for suffering far exceeded most people's imagination, and that psychological torture could be far more devastating than any physical wound. By the time Ivar reached adulthood, he had already earned a reputation among his own people as someone to be feared rather than simply respected. His brothers might command armies through charisma and courage, but Ivar controlled his followers through something far more primal: the absolute certainty that crossing him would result in consequences so horrific that death would seem merciful by comparison. This was the foundation upon which Ivar would build his legend of terror. Not through the honest brutality of the battlefield, but through the cold, methodical application of suffering as both art and science. Chapter 2. The Blood Eagle. Of all the horrific acts attributed to Ivar the Boneless, none captures his particular brand of calculated cruelty better than his execution of King Ella of Northumbria. The Blood Eagle, as this execution method came to be known, was not a Viking invention, but in Ivar's hands, it became something transcendent in its horror. A perfect fusion of Viking religious symbolism, psychological warfare, and sadistic creativity that demonstrated the true depths of human cruelty when intelligence and malice combine. King Ella had killed Ivar's father, Ragnar Lothbrok, by throwing him into a pit filled with venomous snakes. For most Vikings, this would have called for swift revenge, a clean death in battle, or perhaps a more elaborate execution to satisfy honor. But Ivar was not most men, and his concept of justice was something far more terrible than simple revenge. The Blood Eagle began with Ella being forced face down onto the ground, his arms pinned by Ivar's warriors. What followed was a procedure that Ivar had clearly planned. Using a sharp knife, Ivar personally cut through the skin and muscle of Ella's back. But this was only the beginning. One by one, Ivar cut through the ribs at the spine, then used his hands, those same hands weakened by his bone condition, to slowly, carefully pull each rib away from the backbone. The culmination of the Blood Eagle was the most horrific element of all. With the ribs pulled away from the spine like the wings of some monstrous bird, Ivar reached into Ella's chest cavity and pulled out his lungs, spreading them across his shoulders like wings. This wasn't simply an execution. It was a message written in flesh and blood, a demonstration that Ivar's revenge knew no bounds, and that his creativity in inflicting suffering was literally boundless. The psychological impact was exactly what Ivar intended. Word of Ella's death spread throughout Europe, carried by terrified survivors and whispered in the halls of kings. The Blood Eagle became synonymous with Ivar's name, a calling card that preceded his armies and broke the will of opponents before the first sword was drawn. Chapter 3. The Great Heathen Army Orchestrating Mass Terror. While the Blood Eagle demonstrated Ivar's capacity for personal cruelty, it was his leadership of the Great Heathen Army that revealed the true scope of his brutality. This wasn't the random violence of a berserker or the passionate fury of a warrior seeking glory. This was systematic, organized terror on a scale that medieval Europe had never experienced. The Great Heathen Army, which invaded England in 865 CE, was ostensibly formed to avenge Ragnar Lothbrok's death. But under Ivar's strategic guidance, it became something far more sinister, a machine designed not just for conquest, but for the methodical destruction of everything that represented civilization and order in Anglo-Saxon England. Ivar's genius lay in understanding that true terror came not from random acts of violence, but from the systematic destruction of everything his enemies held sacred. While other Viking raiders sought quick wealth and glory, Ivar orchestrated campaigns designed to break the very spirit of resistance. His army's approach to conquest was methodical in its horror. They didn't simply attack military targets or seek quick plunder. Instead, they targeted the foundations of medieval society: monasteries, centers of learning, religious sites, and peaceful farming communities. But it wasn't enough to simply destroy these places. Ivar ensured that the manner of their destruction would serve as a lesson to anyone who might consider resistance. Monasteries, those centers of learning and spiritual life, received particular attention. Ivar understood that monks represented something his enemies valued beyond mere military strength. They embodied faith, knowledge, and hope for the future. The systematic torture and execution of monks served a dual purpose. It eliminated sources of resistance and inspiration while demonstrating that nothing was sacred to Ivar's forces. The methods employed were designed for maximum psychological impact. Monks weren't simply killed. They were tortured in ways that mocked their faith. Some were crucified upside down in deliberate blasphemy. Others were forced to watch as their libraries, those irreplaceable repositories of knowledge, were burned before their eyes, then killed slowly as the flames consumed centuries of learning. But perhaps most terrifying was Ivar's use of what we might call educational atrocities. He would select certain villages or towns, not because they held strategic value, but because their destruction would send a message to other communities. These places would be attacked with a level of systematic brutality designed to ensure that word of what happened would spread far and wide. The inhabitants of these target communities weren't just killed. They were tortured in view of any survivors who were deliberately allowed to escape. These witnesses were living advertisements for Ivar's ruthlessness, carrying tales of horror that would precede his army and break the will of future opponents without a battle being fought. Children were particular targets of this psychological warfare, not because Ivar necessarily took pleasure in their suffering, though he certainly showed no mercy, but because their deaths had the greatest psychological impact on their communities. Parents who heard details of what had happened to children in previous attacks often chose surrender over resistance, knowing that defiance would mean watching their own children suffer similarly horrific fates. The cumulative effect of these tactics was exactly what Ivar intended. The great heathen army's reputation for methodical brutality preceded it wherever it went, creating a climate of terror that often made actual fighting unnecessary. Entire regions would submit rather than face the alternative, and those who did resist often found their will broken by the knowledge of exactly what defeat would mean. Chapter 4. The Psychology of a Monster. What made Ivar the Boneless truly terrifying wasn't just his capacity for violence, but the cold intelligence behind every act of cruelty. This wasn't the random savagery of a mad dog. Even his enemies acknowledged his tactical brilliance and strategic insight. But what set him apart was how he channeled that intelligence exclusively toward the infliction of suffering. Where other leaders might use their mental gifts to inspire loyalty or build lasting institutions, Ivar focused his considerable intellect on perfecting the science of terror. His understanding of human psychology was remarkably sophisticated for his era. He recognized that different people feared different things, and he tailored his methods accordingly. A king might fear the loss of his kingdom, but he would fear the torture of his family even more. A monk might accept martyrdom, but watching his monastery's library burn while listening to the screams of his brothers was another matter entirely. This psychological sophistication extended to his own followers. Ivar understood that leading through terror required a careful balance. His men needed to fear him enough to obey without question, but not so much that they became paralyzed or likely to flee. He achieved this by demonstrating that his cruelty was reserved for enemies and oath-breakers, while those who served him faithfully could expect protection and reward. But perhaps most chilling was Ivar's apparent inability to experience what we would recognize as normal human emotions. Contemporary accounts suggest that he never showed mercy, never displayed regret, and never seemed to take genuine pleasure in anything except the suffering of his enemies. He approached torture and execution with the same methodical precision that a craftsman might bring to his work. This emotional detachment may have been connected to his physical condition. Living with constant pain and physical limitation from birth might have numbed him to the suffering of others, or perhaps created a resentment so deep that he could only find satisfaction in ensuring that others suffered even more than he did. Chapter 5. Legacy of Terror. The true measure of Ivar the Boneless's brutality lies not just in what he did, but in how his actions echoed through history long after his death around 870 CE. His methods of warfare and torture became templates that would be studied and, horrifyingly, employed by cruel leaders for centuries to come. The Blood Eagle execution that Ivar perfected became one of the most feared death sentences in medieval Europe. Even the threat of it was enough to break the will of captured enemies, and rumors of its use preceded Viking armies throughout the known world. The technique's symbolic power, transforming a human being into a grotesque mockery of the eagles sacred to Odin, combined religious blasphemy with physical agony in a way that violated every concept of honorable death that medieval warriors held sacred. But Ivar's influence extended far beyond any single method of execution. Future Viking leaders would consciously employ Ivar's methods, understanding that reputation for extreme cruelty could often achieve victory without the risks associated with actual combat. The Great Heathen Army's campaigns under Ivar's leadership also established new standards for the systematic destruction of civilian populations. While warfare had always involved some degree of brutality toward non-combatants, Ivar elevated this to an art form, demonstrating how the methodical torture of civilians could serve strategic objectives far beyond simple intimidation. Perhaps most disturbing is how Ivar's reputation grew even more terrifying after his death. As stories of his brutality were retold across generations, they became embellished and mythologized, creating a legend that may have exceeded even the horrific reality. This legendary version of Ivar became a boogeyman figure that parents used to frighten children and that enemies invoked when they wanted to justify their own extreme measures. The historical record suggests that some later Viking leaders deliberately cultivated associations with Ivar's memory, understanding that being seen as his spiritual successor could provide tactical advantages in negotiations and warfare. The mere suggestion that a leader might employ the methods of Ivar the Boneless was often enough to secure surrender or tribute without bloodshed. Even more chilling is the evidence that Ivar's techniques were studied and adapted by non-Viking forces. Byzantine military manuals from later centuries contain descriptions of psychological warfare tactics that bear striking similarities to methods pioneered by Ivar's forces. The systematic use of public torture as a deterrent became a feature of medieval warfare that can be traced directly back to the precedents established during the Great Heathen Army's campaigns. The cultural impact of Ivar's brutality extended beyond military affairs into the realm of literature and folklore. He became the archetypal villain in countless medieval tales, the standard against which all other cruel leaders were measured. To be compared to Ivar the Boneless was to be marked as someone who had transcended ordinary human cruelty and entered the realm of pure evil. As our journey into the dark heart of Ivar the Boneless draws to a close, we're left to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the capacity for evil that can emerge when intelligence and opportunity combine with a complete absence of empathy. His story warns us that intelligence without conscience, strategy without mercy, and power without restraint can create monsters whose impact echoes through centuries. In an age where we sometimes romanticize Viking culture and warriors, Ivar the Boneless stands as a stark reminder of the genuine terror that these raiders could inspire. He was not a noble savage or a misunderstood hero. He was a calculated architect of suffering whose methods were so effective and so horrifying that they became templates for cruelty that persisted long after the Viking Age had ended. The man who turned his broken bones into an empire of terror, who transformed weakness into strength through the alchemy of absolute ruthlessness, remains one of history's most chilling examples of human potential directed toward purely evil ends. Ivar the Boneless, too brutal even for his fellow Vikings, and perhaps the most terrifying warrior who ever lived.
The past is never gone. It lives here on Historic Life Stories. Thanks for joining me today. Be sure to check out another fascinating video here on the channel. And if you enjoy the content, please subscribe. Thank you. See you in the next one.